Owen, McLeod and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Laura Marcia Kavanaugh, thanks so much for joining us. Well, there was a time when Irvin Mayfield performed before large audiences, but now he may be appearing before a jury. We'll look tonight at the indictment handed down to the trumpeter and a colleague. We'll also examine purchase activity among local banks, how the new ferry landing affects the riverfront, a new home for the Times-Picayune, the latest on the Surge and Water Board, and the Saints season facing its final countdown. On the line for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4; Kathy Finn, freelance business writer; and Jessica Williams, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And David, over to you on a story that you broke now, what, a couple of...
2.5 years ago, yeah, May 2015.
Now we see federal indictments against Irvin Mayfield and his partner, Markham.
Ronald Markham, that's right. You know, I had been looking at the library spending for years before 2015, and had actually done stories when I was at the Times-Picayune about the way Irvin Mayfield ran the public libraries when he was the chairman of the city board. Then he became the president of the Library Foundation, which takes the donations to support the public libraries. And I noticed that the money going to the public libraries was getting less and less. And finally, when they came out with their report for their 2012 financials, saw that they had given a large amount of money to his jazz orchestra that he founded. So, and Ronald Markham was working for him as well at the jazz orchestra, and both of them were on the foundation, library foundation board that was giving the money. So people were telling us that's a clear conflict of interest, that there's a federal investigation, and I continued to look into it, found the huge spending on things like $15,000 gold-plated trumpet, $18,000 for a week at a hotel in New York City, but there was no action from the feds, and we knew that they were still investigating, and people were starting to wonder if anything was going to come of it. But then this week, the indictment came down, 19 felony counts, including money laundering, fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, obstruction of justice, and so it's pretty serious stuff.
Well, the stories that you were reporting and what was coming out was certainly disconcerting, but I'm sure this is really just causing shockwaves through the music community, I would guess.
Yeah, and you know, Mayfield has continued to perform, some recently actually at a New Orleans Pelicans game not too long ago. He recently sold his house in the Fontainebleau neighborhood for about $500,000. It appears that that was an attempt to try to get Liquid to deal with this, because it seemed like they knew that by then, by late October, he would have known it was coming. It really is sending reverberations, though, because he held a special place, I think, after Hurricane Katrina as a cultural ambassador. Ray Nagin named him the cultural ambassador of the city. He played for presidents and foreign dignitaries, and he had this gold Elysian trumpet that he carried around and traveled around the world with, and there was actually a sheriff's deputy who guarded it for a while. So he kind of became a celebrity associated with New Orleans. He lost his father in the flood in Hurricane Katrina. So he really became a symbol of that. And so I think it's very painful for people to see that he's now being accused of essentially stealing money that's for a cultural purpose, the public libraries. Their defense has always been, well, we put this money into building the New Orleans Jazz Market, a $10 million project in Central City, and that would serve as a music library of sorts, as a part of the library system. But this indictment shows very clearly, or alleges very clearly, that that's not the case, that that money, $1.4 million in total that they transferred out of the Library Foundation accounts, went mostly to lining their own pockets in their salaries, $180,000 plus for swanky hotels in New York City, $23,000 for a Fifth Avenue shopping spree, $15,000 for that gold-plated trumpet. So we'll see if that's their defense at trial, if this goes to trial.
David, for years when we talked about the U.S. Attorney's Office, we knew who the U.S. Attorney was, but there's been a good bit of turnover lately, and the president hasn't finalized his appointments.
Right.
So who's running the office now?
Well, right now there's an interim U.S. Attorney, Dwayne Evans, who is essentially just holding it down, after the departure of Kenneth Polite. So that happened at the beginning of the Trump administration. People may recall that he was there one day, and the next day they found out from Attorney General Jeff Sessions that everybody must leave, everybody must go, who was appointed by Obama. So since then, there has not been a new appointment. We're going to get one. Strasser will be the new U.S. Attorney for this district, but that hasn't been finalized yet.
But are you seeing much evidence of activity from that office?
Well,
other than this?
This is one of the first big, corruption-based white-collar indictments that we've seen. So it has been relatively quiet in this interim period.
Back to Irvin Mayfield, and when the stories first broke and more was coming out, didn't the jazz orchestra say they were going to repay that $1 million? Right,
they did after about a year. They initially told me right away that they would pay it back. Then there was some concern about whether they really owed it. Ron Foreman, who was the chairman of the jazz orchestra at the time, said that, well, the documents show the payments were proper. Of course, that's not what the indictment says. But after that, they finally worked out something where they would pay back $1.1 million, but only half of it in cash and the rest in charitable fundraising performances. But the NoJo, the jazz orchestra, has been defunct essentially, has been dormant since then. So there's not been one penny paid through those. There has been the first installment last December of $96,000 on the 5-year payback of about, I think it was $400 and something thousand. But I don't know that next payment is going to be made. It's due by the end of this year.
Mayfield is being represented by a public defender.
That's right.
Federal public
That's right. Claude
defender.
Kelly, the chief public defender, the federal public defender. He's a very experienced, good trial attorney, but it was very surprising to see Mayfield be declared indigent by a judge, given that, like I said, he just sold his house in Fontainebleau for $500,000. I will say, however, that was only $3,000 more than what he paid for it in 2012. So that may not indicate that he's all that liquid in terms of cash on hand.
And of course, his defense attorney gave a statement that his client has done nothing wrong, and what a shame that this indictment has come down at this time.
Yeah, his comment was that he's disappointed in the timing, and he said he wasn't going to comment on the specifics of the indictment. I also spoke to Mr. Markham's attorney, Sarah Johnson. He has a private attorney, Sarah Johnson, who said today that she also is not going to try this in the media, and will not comment on Mr. Markham's previous comments to us for our reporting back in 2015, nor on the indictment.
Okay, we'll see what happens. All right, David, thank you very much. I'm going to go over to Jessica right now, and there's a new design now for the new ferry terminal building, and also continued design work or input from the public about a bridge that residents said, look, we really need this bridge because we don't want to stand there by railroad tracks and wait for a train.
Residents have said that just at a public meeting this week. They unveiled the latest design for the new ferry terminal, which makes it a little bit easier for you to walk from the terminal to the dock where you can actually get on the ferry. Those walkways are a little shorter than they used to be. However, in the funding discussion, the covering that a lot of residents wanted, that was not included. However, the bridge that a lot of them said we need this in order to be able to get past having to wait for trains forever and missing our ferry, that was included. There has not been a design yet released for the bridge, but we are hopeful to see that, or Transdev is hopeful to see that in the coming year.
And that was really a major complaint and also protest when the initial design came out was, where's the bridge? We need this bridge over the railroad tracks. I mean, residents really let their got their point across that they need this bridge.
They did, and you saw several different community organizations, neighborhood organizations banding together and saying with one voice that we really need this. Newly elected Councilwoman-elect Kristen Gisselson Palmer really led that charge, and also Councilwoman Nadine Ramsey worked with the residents to come up with a solution for the bridge. In the coming year, what we should expect to see is more meetings, more discussion around what the specific design is going to look like, because that was a major criticism early on, that they didn't come to the public initially and even reveal the design for the bridge.
These are a pedestrian ferry. Are we done with seeing vehicle ferries?
There aren't any right now. I believe that the new catamaran-style boats are going to be able to transport 150 passengers each, and there is going to be some space for bikes and scooters. There was also a big push overall to make the ferry ADA compliant, but as far as vehicles, that is not a part of the design for the overall ferry boats.
And the overall design is meant to really impact the entire riverfront.
It is. It was designed to be a more open design. This is in line with the mayor's overarching vision for an open space of riverfront. If you recall that landmark deal that they signed with the Public Belt Railroad to open up that wharf space, Governor Nichols and Esplanade Avenue, and really give that, tourists and residents an opportunity to walk directly from one part of the riverfront to another. This was seen as a continuation of that, and also a potential springboard for more development in the area.
And nearby is the World Trade Center site. I know you've been following the start and stop and start and stop. Where is that right now? Is it in progress or?
That is a go. To my understanding, they are on track to open up in 2019. They are moving forward with rehabilitation of the building, and then they will get the redesign in there, and they are hoping to have that on track, not in time for the city's tricentennial next year, but by 2019 they're hoping to see some doors open there.
And Four Seasons is still
Four
on
Seasons
board 100%.
is still on board, yes. Yeah. After that entirely, I believe it was 2 years long of a legal battle between the losing bidder on that project that just didn't seem to go away, Mr. Fisher and Two Canal Street investors.
The fifth place finisher.
But tell me, what is the timeline on the ferry terminal? When do we think that's all going to be completed?
They're aiming, I believe I heard, within 18 months of demolition. And they're hoping to have something in place for sure by I believe I've heard the ferry boats will come for sure by March of 2018, and then the terminal itself probably into 2019.
When will demolition start in the old terminal?
Relatively soon.
Relatively
soon, yeah.
Okie doke. All right, Jessica, thanks a lot. Let's go over to Kathy right now, and some more changes in banking landscape here.
Yeah, some smaller banks. So we had word this week that two of the smaller banks in the New Orleans area, Union Savings and Loan and Hibernia Bank Corp, are merging. Now, this is not the Hibernia that we used to know, the big Hibernia National Bank, which long ago merged into Capital One. This is a small bank that goes back many decades in the local area. These two banks merged. It's not a huge deal. The combined assets are probably around $200 million, which is not huge by bank standards. The big banks are well into the billions, and we have some, maybe a dozen or so that are around $1 billion or so. So these are quite small banks. But it's a continuation of a trend that we've been seeing for a few years, not only in Louisiana, but across the country. And the reason it's happening is because their costs are just rising all the time, and the banks need scale in order to cover those costs. It's been a very low interest rate environment. That's one factor. And so banks, even though they don't have to pay very much on deposit, almost nothing, in fact, they also are not getting high rates on their loans, and lending is their bread and butter, especially of these smaller banks. And the smaller banks do not have the kind of fee income that you see with the large institutions that have all sorts of other services they can charge separately for. That makes a big difference, which means that they have to cover all of their expenses out of that net interest margin. And it's tough in an environment like this. But the bigger factors, I think, are the rising costs of regulations. You won't find a banker in America who does not complain about the cost of regulations and complying with regulations. And it's particularly tough on the small banks because there's just, they still have a lot to comply with, but they don't have the money to hire a huge staff of accountants and the compliance officers. So that's a factor. And I think another big factor that's going on, particularly in the last several years, is the rising cost of technology. They've been forced to keep up with their larger peers in terms of, online banking, and all kinds of technology and conveniences that customers are increasingly expecting, even of these smaller banks. And so with those rising costs, they almost have to merge in order to get the scale they need. I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, talking about some of the mergers that had occurred in South Louisiana. And just, I talked to a couple of analysts who said that, the magic number is kind of, you have to reach at least $500 million in assets in order to really cover what you're going to have to pay for in terms of regulations and all the other services. And there are a great many banks in the area that do not meet that standard, not a standard, but that size.
So this new deal, this acquisition, when will that take place, and how is it going to impact customers?
I think you won't find that it will impact customers very much. I think the combined institution is going to take the Hibernia name rather than Union Savings. And I think you will see, they'll have all of their branch offices. It's the same way that it operates when any kind of merger occurs. The customers are usually not affected much at all. There could be a branch closing, but I doubt it because they didn't have that many branches to begin with. So I would say we won't see too much difference there.
But we should acknowledge it's an old name. I think it started like in the 1880s. And so,
both Union Savings and Hibernia Bank Corp are very old names in the local area. And then we saw another one, kind of ironically, Gulf Coast Bank made an announcement this week that they are acquiring an SBA, Small Business Association lender out of Texas. This is another small acquisition, but it's the same principle. They need more assets in order to cover their costs and in order to spread those costs across a larger area.
All right, Kathy, thanks a lot. A good banking lesson from Kathy. Thanks. Over to Errol. Times-Picayune going to new digs.
I think this is an interesting story. It's a little story, but it's a media story. But to me, it's also an urban type story. When the Picayune announced its dramatic changes a few weeks ago, cutting down to 3 times a week and closing its big facility, with some fanfare, they announced that they were going to move to the top floor of Canal Place in a huge space up there. I mean, if you wanted a view, you had a view up there. If you wanted lots of room, you had lots of room. But it was always a bit convenient and more. They were the first to admit way more space than they needed, and so they announced this week that they're moving in a few months. They're moving to an old historic building on South Peter and St. Joseph's, and they're going to have the first floor of the building. And in terms of feet, they weren't shy about talking about it at all. They're going from 26,000 feet to 8,200 square feet, and so it's a smaller operation, but they don't have the same needs that they did. I mean, the old newspapers had printing presses and in areas where you'd lay out newspapers, and they don't have any of that now. Both of the newspapers are printed out of town now, and the Picayune has its own layout facility elsewhere in Jefferson Parish. And so really what you need is an office with newspaper people, and people can go in and out. But in terms of the way cities work, I think it's kind of cool, because newspapers should be like that. It should be something that you could have access to and go back and forth. In the old Picayune facility, that big thing we always saw along the interstate on Howard Avenue, everybody could see it, but nobody could get to it.
Yeah.
I mean,
as somebody who worked there, I can tell you, if you can't get there from here, as they used to say up in New England, that you could get there going in one direction, but not the other.
They've still got people that are lost, and they got drones looking for them, or something like that. And so for what the papers have become, that's probably sort of a nice thing. But the other thing is it's kind of a throwback, because that is near the area that used to be known as Newspaper Row, around Picayune Place, where you had several newspapers together. And so now the Advocate and Jessica and I were figuring out that the Advocate and the Picayune would be about, 3 minutes apart?
3 minutes apart, only a couple blocks, actually.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah.
And so this is old school journalism. So now there'll probably be some bar that'll develop as a favorite hangout for the newspaper reporters.
So they can team up and do
Yeah.
stories, right?
There you go.
So we'll look for that in the future.
Yeah,
Jessica, from you guys.
and we'll go back to the old days. And so the industry has changed in many ways, of course. And I think the biggest thing is both papers being printed out of town. But if you get reporters back at the neighborhood level on the street, that might be good too.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, well, good luck to them.
For
when
Jessica,
they're
that's
new
your
home.
beat around that area too. I mean, you could just walk to cover the riverfront.
That's true.
That's true.
That's true. Or catch one of the new bikes that are down
Oh, yeah, right, the
town.
blue bikes.
Blue bikes.
That's right. Okay, E, thanks a lot. And over to David now, and the latest in the continuing saga of the New Orleans Sewerage and Water Board. What's going on?
Well, as a part of our Down the Drain special last month, we had found that there was this major oversight problem with the city council, that they had not pursued the powers that were granted them by state law to oversee the Sewerage and Water Board. And one of those key things that they had was the requirement to file quarterly reports of contracts and very specific details about what the Sewerage and Water Board was doing, so it would be in public and in front of the people's representatives on the council. Well, I found out that they had not made any of those reports to the council. The council had not received any. There were only 2 that were actually made available by the Sewerage and Water Board. Unclear if they ever were delivered to the city council.
So are we talking about just this city council or councils previous?
It only took effect in 2014, so
Okay,
it would be
all right.
this city
This city
council.
council.
So it kind of was a black eye for both the city council and for the Sewerage and Water Board in this respect. So the city council was not happy about this, and after our story, they called a meeting with the Sewerage and Water Board and said, hey, your December quarterly report is due. Well, they didn't show up. So they threatened to issue subpoenas to make them show up and make them file this report. But they ended up filing the report without the subpoenas needing to go out. But they filed it this week, and it showed that of 253 capital projects totaling $1.2 billion, they had only completed 6% of it, or about $78 million. And that's for important projects, including these power projects. And a power project that I had featured was the turbine that has not been fixed for 5 plus almost 6 years, turbine number 4. And one of the things in this latest report shows that it has now cost more than $31 million to try to repair that. It won't be ready until next year. That is more money than it costs the Corps of Engineers to buy a brand new turbine, install it, connect it, and give it its own building on the Sewerage and Water Board campus. So they're now officially over that point where they could have, made the decision that was recommended to them to buy new stuff and get out of this old 100-year-old equipment.
David, who's running the Sewerage and Water Board now? I mean, there was the management firm,
Right,
but
so-
they left November 30th, but
Correct.
not all
The
left.
interim management guy who's kind of been out in front on this, Paul Rainwater, who used to run the Louisiana Recovery Authority after
Right.
Katrina and everything, a very competent guy who's takes us 30,000, 60,000 foot level view of these things. He stays on until the end of this month. But when they called them before the board this week, he was not there. And a lot of the answers from the people, this Jade Brown, who's the new attorney for the board, Ryan Burney, who's not even associated with the board, he's with the mayor's office, were there answering questions from the city council and basically saying, we don't know. We either just got here or we're not the Sewerage and Water Board. So they've got to figure this out, and apparently there's now ordinances in effect forcing them to come on specific dates and bring the actual core competency people who actually know this stuff to testify.
Okay, and what about the vacancies? I mean, there are so many, there's
Over
an
300.
employee shortage there.
Yeah, and there have been, pointing fingers back and forth. Oh, it's civil service. Oh, it's just, you can't compete with the private sector, blah, blah, blah. They have hired an outside firm, or they're looking to hire an outside firm, and that's got employees very upset and concerned that this is the beginning of privatization, that they're giving up control over the Sewerage and Water Board to private companies exceedingly.
So basically, we got to hope for not a lot of heavy rainfall.
Well,
Are pumps working okay?
They've got almost all of them back up, they say, and the power capacity is at a high level because they brought in all kinds of backups, but that's not a long-term solution. So we're going to stay on them with our down-the-drain investigation and make sure that they find a real permanent solution.
And have people to man those pumps,
Exactly,
too. Exactly.
right.
All right, David, thanks a lot. Let's go over to Errol now. And the Saints, well, the final drive now.
We're getting close to the point of the city getting Saints crazy. When that happens, just watch where you go, okay? Because they get crazy. I was looking at one of these rankings about the probabilities of teams making the playoffs, and the Saints they have is a 92% chance of making the playoffs. Now, there's all kinds of different levels of making the playoffs. There's getting the first round. There's getting home field advantage. There's being a wild card in which you don't have home field advantage, and so there's several permutations. But just to get into the playoffs is a place where we haven't been in several years. But the Saints' chances look pretty good.
Errol, don't you dare put the mouth on the Saints.
I'm not. I was about to
I'll
say.
be very upset.
I was about to say they're playing the Jets this week, which should be.
No, don't say it.
Okay, so I shouldn't say that. Okay, okay. Well, I shouldn't say that there. Alvin Kamara, that their star running back, who left that Atlanta game because of a concussion protocol, is back, and they say in full form.
That's
So
good.
to have him playing the Jets here Sunday with Kamara back is probably a good sign. Meanwhile, Carolina is playing Green Bay. Green Bay's had a hit-and-miss season, but Aaron Rodgers will be back this week. And so there's some good signs out there.
On the downside, we have Sean Payton being fined by the NFL $10,000 for going on
10,000 for his behavior last week.
And Pete
walking around the
Carroll,
field.
Pete Carroll and Seattle Seahawks also.
Yeah. But that kind of stuff just fires up the players.
Yeah.
I mean that's actually a plus.
It's like getting a
They're fired up
technical or
anyway.
toss out of an NBA game, and then your team starts playing better.
Yeah, let's go win one for the coach.
Yeah.
And so that's a good thing. And so the possibilities are good. And so there's 3 games left. 2 of them are home games. But the big thing is the week after playing Atlanta here after that game, and it's on Christmas Eve. There's something about Atlanta Falcons and Christmas Eve that shouldn't go together. There should be some kind of law
Amen to that.
prohibiting that combination. And just to think the effect that's going to have on people's Christmas Eves that evening, okay? And so that's going to be a big impact. So for all the people, frivolity and packing and all that, what's going to be dominant Christmas Eve is that game.
So it's at noon here,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Is it possible for that time to be changed, or is it kind of firmly
I
there
think
at noon?
at this point it's not going to be changed, right? Because the flex games have to be determined 2 weeks in advance.
I don't know, but it's that happened a couple weeks ago where they changed, where they flexed it on Christmas Eve, and it was just so anyway.
All right. Okay.
Getting
We're all
close.
thinking very positive about the Saints.
Yes.
It's going to be 3 good games ahead. All right, Errol.
Well,
looking ahead.
if it's Christmas, it means it's almost Mardi Gras. And it looks like there's going to be a big change coming up for parades along the St. Charles route. That when they get to Canal Street now, they're going to no longer do that left turn loop, and instead they're going to just turn to the right and head toward Chapatoulas.
Oh, really?
It's going to save distance, and the police are seeing it as a safety measure. But it's going to have an impact on business toward that end of Canal Street, though.
Okay. Thanks, E.
I'm going to have more on the Irvin Mayfield indictment, and also I encourage everybody to check out my colleague Katie Moore's reporting on Colonel Mike Edmondson scandal with the state police,
another-
and the Advocate has done a tremendous job breaking stories on this.
All right. Will do. Kathy.
We'll see what happens on the Cafe Habana story. The neighborhood has been fighting it still. They appealed decision to let it go forward there at the edge of the French Quarter. The other day, the Fourth Circuit ruled in favor of the city and against the neighbors in that case. We'll see if it is appealed further or what happens next.
Okay, Kathy.
We have still got 5 months left of this current city council and this current Landrieu administration. And one of the major decisions on the city council's plate leading into May 5th is a decision on the fate of the power plant that Energy wants to put in New Orleans East. They actually had hearings on whether or not it should go there this week, and the council's expected to make a decision by February at the earliest.
Okay. Thanks a lot, you all, for being here, and thank you guys, too, for joining us. And, of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod, and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.